There exists a sanctuary of silence deep beneath the heart of Rome, a place where one cannot simply arrive, but must be granted entry. It is a realm where history is not curated for display, but is instead confined, locked away within the most profound chambers, secured by three immense layers of iron doors, and enveloped by walls that absorb all sound, returning no echo. Here, for more than 1,000 years, the Vatican has amassed millions upon millions of pages, not for the purpose of revelation, but for a long and patient vigil. Imagine handwritten letters from pontiffs that were never dispatched. Gaze upon the bindings of books that altered the course of civilization. Consider the records of Marian apparitions that were quietly examined and then dismissed. Think of the whispered exchanges between the Holy See and emperors, between popes and fascists, between cardinals and the intelligence agencies of the West. Picture works of art, masterpieces of breathtaking beauty that the world has never been permitted to see. What reason could the Vatican have for hoarding such treasures of memory, yet never speaking of them? This account is not woven from the threads of conspiracy. It is a story about the most deeply intuned memories in the entire world of faith. I invite you into the secrets of the Vatican archives, a place where we will not rehash what is already known, but will instead slowly, carefully draw back the veil from that which was always meant to remain concealed. There was a time when I was one of the very few souls granted passage into the restricted sections of this labyrinth of memory. Do not misunderstand my position. I was not a cardinal draped in crimson, nor was I a celebrated historian whose name was known in the great universities. I certainly did not descend from any noble lineage. I was merely a caretaker, a custode, as they say in Italian. My prescribed duties were simple: to clean the dust from ancient shelves, to transcribe notes for the scholars, and to deliver the approved, sanctioned documents to their reading desks. But on certain nights, when the old priest who supervised the reading room had succumbed to sleep and the single oil lamp cast a gentle, wavering glow in the corner, I would find myself drawn to doors that no one else would dare even glance at. With a heart pounding against my ribs, I would quietly turn a key, open a passage, and step through. From that first illicit moment, there was never any possibility of turning back. I now understand, with the clarity that comes only at the end of a long life, that my own time is dwindling. In these final years, my heart beats with a slower, more deliberate rhythm. My eyes, once sharp, now grow dim in the soft candlelight, and my hands have begun to tremble when they touch the vellum and parchment that once felt as natural to me as my own skin. But before all that I have seen and all that I know vanishes with me into the great silence, I feel an undeniable compulsion to speak. My intention is not to shock, nor to lay blame, nor to offer absolution. I speak so that perhaps one person somewhere out there may begin to comprehend. The truth has never resided entirely in the light, nor has it ever been fully consumed by the darkness. It exists in a liminal space between, waiting patiently for a voice to give it form. I have held the unsent letters of Pope Pius XII, resting in an unmarked drawer, their ink still vivid with an unspoken anguish. I have read the forbidden texts, books once deemed such a profound threat to the foundations of faith that they were placed on a list of damnation. I have stood in a silent vault before canvases by Caravaggio that were never hung in any gallery, because the eyes of the figures in those portraits stared directly into a kind of suffering that theology did not have the courage to confront. And most profoundly, I have come to realize that the secrets we are forbidden to reveal are not hidden because they are false. They are hidden because they are too devastatingly true to be readily accepted by a world that prefers its faith simple and its history clean. I do not ask for your belief. I can offer no tangible proof that the world would ever recognize. But if your ears are still open to my words, if your eyes are still following this narrative, and if somewhere deep within you, a part of you still senses that beneath every gilded halo and every triumphant monument there lies something more complex, something unresolved, then perhaps it is you for whom this testimony is meant. Because one day, those iron doors will not be sealed forever. And when they finally swing open, you will understand why I could never, ever go back. I once perceived the Vatican as nothing more than a religious emblem, a place of public prayer where popes in pristine white robes address the faithful in the open air of St. Peter's Square. That, I now know, was merely the surface, the grand facade presented to the world. Behind the ancient, weathered stone, beneath the soaring domes that touch the Roman sky, and beyond doors secured with triple locking mechanisms of iron and brass, there lies a universe that the vast majority of humanity will never be permitted to witness. This is the world of the Vatican's secret archives. People often use the term secret archives, but its formal Latin name is Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum, which more accurately translates to the Pope's private apostolic archive. The Latin word secretum does not carry the modern connotation of secrecy, as in a conspiracy, but rather that of privacy. This immense collection of history belongs to the Pope himself, personally. It is not the property of the Catholic Church as a global institution. And yet, it is precisely this concept of privacy that has made this place the fertile ground for endless speculation, from political inquests to searches for legendary lost relics. The archive itself is a staggering entity, containing roughly 85 kilometers of shelving, holding over 35,000 catalog volumes that document events from the 8th century all the way to our present day. However, only a carefully curated fraction of this is ever made accessible to visiting scholars. The most sensitive materials, the documents classified as politically volatile or those simply not yet released, remain sealed away deep within the inner vaults. And it is in that silent, protected core that some of the most pivotal, contentious, and world-altering moments in the history of Europe and Christianity are preserved. Among these preserved items is an original copy of the letter that Galileo Galilei sent to the church authorities in 1613. In it, he passionately attempted to argue that his astronomical observations did not contradict the Holy Scriptures. But by 1616, the church had declared heliocentrism a heresy and formally banned its teaching. In 1633, Galileo was put on trial by the Inquisition, a powerful tribunal whose own chilling activities are also meticulously recorded in documents buried deep within these same archives. One of the most sought-after collections pertains to the trial and dissolution of the Knights Templar in the 14th century. For centuries, it was commonly believed that the Vatican had systematically destroyed all records pertaining to their trial. But in 2001, an Italian paleographer named Barbara Frail discovered a document known as the Chinon Parchment. This parchment revealed that Pope Clement V had, in fact, secretly absolved the Templar leaders of heresy. This discovery directly challenged the long-held narrative that the Church had consented to their brutal suppression. It raised a haunting question that still lingers in the air of the archives. Why was this specific truth concealed for more than 700 years? Then there are the vast collections of documents concerning the Vatican's intricate relationships with the authoritarian regimes of the 20th century, most notably Nazi Germany. The archives contain hundreds of letters exchanged between the Holy See and Hitler's regime, alongside detailed reports sent by German bishops back to Rome. These materials strongly suggest that the Vatican possessed early and detailed knowledge of the systematic mass murder of Jewish people. Yet, their public response was one of profound and confounding complexity, a policy shaped by theological caution, cold political calculation, and an ever-present fear of brutal persecution. In 2020, following decades of intense controversy and pressure, the Vatican finally unsealed a portion of the archives related to Pope Pius XII, who led the Church from 1939 to 1958, the very years of the Second World War. This was a watershed moment for historians, as Pius XII had long been accused of maintaining a damning silence during the Holocaust. The newly accessible documents began to reveal a far more nuanced picture. He was not entirely silent, but chose to operate quietly behind the scenes, using covert channels to save lives. It was a strategy whose morality and ultimate effectiveness continue to spark fierce debate among scholars today. But the archives are not confined to matters of religion and statecraft. They also safeguard handwritten letters penned by Michelangelo, architectural sketches by Bernini, a heart-wrenching farewell note from Mary, Queen of Scots, written just moments before her execution, and even a letter sent from a Native American tribal chief to the Pope in the 19th century, pleading for recognition of his people's humanity. The Vatican archives serve as a gateway, connecting the entirety of human history, from the bloody fervor of the Crusades to the quiet revolutions of science, from profound theological schisms that tore Christianity apart to the subtle political intrigues of the modern world. Despite holding such an unparalleled treasure trove of human experience, access to the archive is rigorously controlled. Each year, only a small number of scholars, typically between 60 and 80, are granted permission to study on-site. They must submit a formal application, specify their field of research with precision, and adhere to a strict set of rules. No photographs are permitted, no photocopies can be made, and no document is ever allowed to leave the reading room. Most critically, no one is ever granted unrestricted access. The most sensitive areas, the inner sanctums of memory, remain hermetically sealed. I'm not attempting to present you with firm conclusions. I do not profess to know the complete truth. But I believe that when you stand before those seemingly endless shelves, with the dust of centuries resting gently upon the trembling, handwritten lines from the 10th century, you begin to grasp why the Vatican guards this place with such unwavering vigilance. Some truths are simply too vast, too overwhelming, to be exposed all at once. Some stories, if they were ever fully told, would compel us to question the very foundations upon which our civilization and our faith have been built. If a single collection of documents could encapsulate the sheer sensitivity and power contained within these walls, it would likely be the records detailing Christianity's great and painful divide, the schism between Catholicism and Protestantism. Few people are aware that in the nascent days of the Reformation, a series of secret exchanges between Martin Luther and certain Vatican emissaries were meticulously recorded. These handwritten notes, penned in a slanted, brownish ink, once moved a visiting Dutch scholar to tears. He wept not because of the theological disagreements, but because the documents made it devastatingly clear that both sides had, at one point, desperately tried to prevent the split, only to be inexorably pushed apart by the potent forces of human pride and political power. As early as the 1530s, the Vatican covertly dispatched envoys to the German principalities with the mission of negotiating with the reformist factions. Among these documents are detailed statements from Bishop Girolamo Aleandro, a theologian and diplomat who went so far as to propose theological concessions that were, for the time, exceptionally rare, all in an effort to preserve the unity of the Church. But when Luther's responses arrived, cautious, yet unyieldingly firm, the Church hierarchy turned away, and history was set upon an irreversible course. These materials are now kept in a sealed dossier, accessible only to researchers with the most advanced credentials and a purpose for their inquiry that has been clearly and convincingly justified. Another subject that once sent a profound chill down my spine was the vast collection of records from the Inquisition. The Vatican still possesses thousands of indictments, verbatim interrogation transcripts, and death sentences issued to those accused of heresy between the 12th and 19th centuries. One of the most infamous cases is that of Giordano Bruno, a philosopher, astrologer, and outspoken advocate for the theory of a boundless universe filled with countless worlds. The documents concerning Bruno's trial reveal not only the brilliance of his intellectual arguments, but also the deep inner conflict of the clergy who were forced to sit in judgment of him. In one internal note, a cleric scribbled a haunting thought: "If we spare him, our doctrine will be seen to waver. But if we burn him, history will never forgive us." In the end, Bruno was executed by fire in 1600 at the Campo de' Fiori. The long, heavy silence that followed his death for centuries remains one of the clearest reflections of the enduring and often brutal tension between institutional faith and unfettered knowledge. The archives also contain an immense collection of records detailing the Vatican's interactions with secular empires, most notably with Napoleon Bonaparte. When Napoleon's armies invaded Italy, he issued a direct order for the most valuable Vatican documents to be seized and shipped to Paris. Tens of thousands of items were hastily packed into crates, sealed, and transported across the Alps. A great many of them never returned. The documents that the Vatican did manage to reclaim after Napoleon's final defeat are still specially classified. I once laid eyes on a handwritten note by Pope Pius VII, in which he described the profound feeling of losing the very soul of the Church as its most ancient texts were loaded onto French wagons. The document was written in a dark charcoal ink with a small, meticulous script, and at the bottom of the last page was a single, devastating line: Nadati Summus. We have been stripped bare. One of the most surprising revelations for me came from the diplomatic correspondence between the Vatican and various Asian nations. Few realize that in the 17th century, the Vatican secretly exchanged letters with the Tokugawa shogunate of Japan, even during a period when Christianity was brutally suppressed there. The letters were smuggled by Portuguese missionaries, hidden in the holds of merchant ships, and concealed inside small, hollowed-out wooden statues to avoid detection. One letter from 1611, ordered by Tokugawa Ieyasu himself, stated with stark clarity, "We do not accept a faith that divides families and loyalties, but we respect the knowledge and the dedication your missionaries bring." The Vatican preserved that letter with immense care, a quiet and sorrowful monument to the first and ultimately failed diplomatic contact with a powerful and closed Asian empire. And then there is a little-known section of the archive devoted entirely to maps and architectural blueprints of lost churches, abandoned monasteries, forgotten fortresses, and ancient catacombs. Among them are detailed maps showing the locations of ancient dioceses that vanished completely due to war, plague, or political upheaval. One map that still haunts my memory is the floor plan of Montsegur Abbey, the site of a brutal siege and mass burning in 1244 during the crusade against the Cathars. On that specific map, there is a strange, faint marking, an escape route that does not appear in any official historical record. No one knows if the last Cathars managed to use it to flee, but the document remains, neither confirmed nor denied. And like so many other secrets in this vast archive, it stands as a silent reminder that history has never been a simple story with a clear beginning and end. Deep within the most heavily guarded section of the archives, I remember one room with particular clarity. It was a place that held records categorized under the heading of political affiliations between the Vatican and global powers from the 19th century to the present day. The boxes were arranged with perfect neatness by country. Each one represented a fragment of memory, a piece of truth that remained untouched by the polished narratives found in official history books. Most people are aware that the Vatican became an independent state in 1929 following the Lateran Treaty between Pope Pius XI and Benito Mussolini. But few truly grasped that before that treaty, from 1870 onward, when the Kingdom of Italy annexed the Papal States, the Vatican existed in a state of near total isolation for almost 60 years. It was a nation without recognized borders, a sovereign entity existing within the very heart of Rome. During that period, the Pope steadfastly refused to recognize the legitimacy of the Italian government and, as a matter of principle, never once stepped beyond the Vatican walls. And it was during this tense, isolated era that the Church quietly and methodically constructed an elaborate network of secret communication with other nations, especially France, Austria, Spain, and the United States. One document I found, dated 1922, reveals that the Vatican once sent a confidential message to the American president, Warren G. Harding, offering to act as a mediator between the United States and the divided Catholic nations in post-World War I Europe. This episode has never appeared in any official history, primarily because the Vatican had no legal standing as a state at that time. Yet the memorandum still exists, complete with a signature and an intact seal. When I first touched it, the paper was brittle and the corners were darkened with age, but the text was so vivid it felt as though history itself was whispering directly into my ear. The era of the Second World War brought a veritable avalanche of sensitive material into the archives. Dozens of reports, sent from local bishops across Europe to the Vatican, clearly and horrifyingly documented the mass murder of Jewish people in Poland, Germany, and even France. One particularly harrowing report, dated 1942 and sent from Krakow, was written by Cardinal Adam Sapieha, who would later become the spiritual advisor to Pope John Paul II. He wrote, with chilling simplicity, "If we do not speak out, we will bear the guilt of our complicity before God." Yet even such urgent and desperate pleas were met with a profound and public silence. Why did the Vatican delay its condemnation of this genocide? Scholars have long debated whether it was a calculated strategy to protect the Church and its followers in occupied territories. But one document I once read, handwritten by a member of the Papal Council, revealed a deeper, more existential complexity. It warned of the immense risk of losing control over the faithful if their belief was pulled into the maelstrom of political ideology. In other words, the Vatican feared that taking a definitive side might fracture the global Church itself, shattering its unity for generations. That institutional silence lasted until the 1960s, when the Vatican embarked upon one of the most significant reforms in modern Church history, the Second Vatican Council. The files generated from that council constitute one of the largest and most intricate sections of the entire archive. Thousands upon thousands of pages document intense theological debates, political responses from world governments, full transcripts of bishops' speeches, and meticulous analyses of the Church's shifting authority in a rapidly secularizing world. I once read the transcript of a debate between two high-ranking cardinals over whether to permit the use of local languages instead of Latin during Massachusetts. One argued passionately, "If we abandon Latin, we abandon the very symbol of eternity." The other replied with equal force, "If we do not change, we will abandon the people." The council was not merely about language. It marked the Vatican's first genuine and public opening to dialogue with Jews, Buddhists, Muslims, and even atheists. The archive still holds an unpublished draft of a speech in which Pope Paul VI intended to issue a formal apology for the Vatican's silence during the Holocaust. In the end, that speech was replaced with a far more neutral and diplomatic version. No one knows for certain why the change was made. Only a small handwritten note in a margin of the original draft remains, written in Latin, "Tempus non dum venit." The time has not yet come. As I slowly turn the pages of these records, day after day, year after year, I never saw evidence of the kind of grand, overarching global conspiracy that wild theories often suggest. What I saw instead was a constant, agonizing struggle between faith and politics, between absolute morality and pragmatic survival. The Vatican archives do not lie. They simply wait patiently for someone with the courage and the fortitude to read, to understand, and to accept that history has never been black or white, but has always existed in infinite shades of gray. There is one section of the archives that has always weighed most heavily upon my soul. These are the records concerning the intricate and often painful relationship between the Vatican and the colonial empires, particularly during the 15th to the 19th centuries. The faded pages stored inside those boxes contain no direct accusations, no formal statements of support for war or for the stripping of human freedom. Yet, nestled between the carefully composed lines of diplomatic prose lies a quiet, unassailable truth. Faith once traveled alongside the sword of European colonialism as it spread its dominion across the globe. In 1493, just 1 year after Christopher Columbus arrived in the Americas, Pope Alexander VI issued the papal bull known as Inter Caetera. In this sweeping decree, he effectively divided the non-Christian world into two vast zones of influence, one for Spain, the other for Portugal, as if the Church possessed the divine authority to distribute the territories of the entire planet. That document still rests within the Vatican archives, filed away in a thick folder labeled Decrees Concerning the New World. It is written in a formal, elegant Latin, and it bears the crimson wax seal of the Holy See. Holding it in my hands, I felt a deep and profound chill, for this single piece of parchment marked a moment when faith was politicized to its most extreme and arrogant degree. Attached to that decree are numerous letters exchanged between the Vatican and the monarchs of Portugal, Spain, and later, France and Belgium. In these letters, the popes requested assurances for the propagation of the faith and the protection of missionaries in the newly acquired territories. But the reality on the ground was often one of brutal bloodshed, systematic cultural erasure, and desperate cries for help from protesting members of the clergy. Their dissenting voices are also preserved, small in number, but present nonetheless, like tiny sparks of light in a deep and suffocating darkness. One such voice was that of Father Bartolomé de las Casas, who wrote directly to Pope Paul III in 1537. In his letter, he described in harrowing detail the mass executions of indigenous people in the Caribbean, of churches being built upon blood-soaked soil, and of the deafening silence of religious authorities in the face of such atrocities. Reading that letter felt suffocating. It was not written as a prayer. It was a desperate plea for help, not only for the victims, but for the very conscience of the Church itself. Also preserved in the archives is a draft of the apostolic brief Sublimis Deus, issued in 1537 by Pope Paul III. In it, he declared that the indigenous peoples of the Americas were indeed truly human, possessed of souls and the right to receive the gospel, and that they should not be enslaved. It was a remarkably progressive document for its time. Yet, tragically, its application was swiftly withdrawn under immense pressure from European monarchs who refused to relinquish the immense economic benefits of slavery. As one moves forward into the 19th century, the Vatican's diplomatic role in protecting its religious interests within the African and Asian colonies becomes increasingly apparent. In the archives related to Indochina, I once read through a thick dossier detailing the presence of French missionaries in Vietnam long before the French invasion. There were letters sent back to Rome describing the intense pressures faced by Catholic converts under the Nguyen dynasty. But interwoven into these reports were phrases like opportunity to expand influence and mediating role with Western merchants, lines that reveal how faith and secular power had begun to merge in ways that were almost impossible to separate. It is crucial to note that the Vatican did not directly order colonial conquests. Yet, through its stamps of approval, its formal blessings, and the moral legitimacy it extended to the conquering powers, one can clearly trace the Church's role in validating empires and in soothing the consciences of those who did the conquering. The Vatican archives also contain many records that reveal powerful internal dissent. More than a few priests, monks, and bishops protested the abuse of religion for colonial purposes. One document from 1885 tells of a French bishop in the Congo who submitted a formal protest to the Vatican after witnessing hundreds of people having their hands amputated for failing to meet their rubber quotas for King Leopold II's brutal company. The Vatican's official response was recorded in a single, brief line: "We pray for them." But intervention is beyond our reach. Perhaps that is why the Vatican archives are not just a repository of memory. They are also a mirror, one that reflects the fragile and often blurred boundary between faith and politics, between righteousness and raw power. As I gaze upon the cracked, red wax seals, the elegant signatures of popes, cardinals, kings, and merchants, I am constantly reminded that history is never a linear path. And the Vatican, for all of its professed sanctity, was once an active participant in decisions that irrevocably reshaped the course of human civilization. If you believe the Vatican's significant role in global politics concluded in the Middle Ages, or even during the Second World War, you might be astonished to learn that the archives continued to record pivotal moments of history well into the latter half of the 20th century. One of the most secure and restricted areas in the Vatican archives houses the diplomatic records of the Holy See's engagement with global powers during the Cold War, particularly its activities in Eastern Europe, Latin America, and the Soviet Union. I vividly recall the first time I was granted access to the thick file on Poland from the 1970s, the period when the Solidarity movement began to emerge as a powerful symbol of anti-communist resistance. Many people know that Pope John Paul II, the first Polish pope, staunchly supported this movement, but few realize the extent to which the Vatican, through covert channels, sent funds, printing equipment, and even intelligence reports to the opposition groups. These actions are documented with startling clarity in the internal reports. One memorandum, sent from the Vatican's Secretariat of State to the Apostolic Nuncio in Warsaw, bears the handwritten note of Cardinal Casaroli himself. It reads, "This is not merely a defense of the faith. This is a moment of survival." These documents reveal that the Vatican was not simply a passive observer, but a highly sophisticated political actor, using its unique soft power to influence major shifts in the global order. Poland was not the only focus of its attention. The Vatican also intervened deeply, though often indirectly, in Latin America. In one confidential file concerning Argentina during the years 1976 to 1983, the period of the Dirty War, I came across deeply troubling reports, desperate pleas from local bishops, lists of kidnapped priests and nuns, and the Vatican's own conflicted responses. One telegram from Buenos Aires referenced Father Carlos Mujica, who was assassinated for his work supporting the poor and vocally opposing military violence. The Vatican's official reply, however, simply stated, "We cannot publicly take sides in an internal conflict." That sentence has stayed with me for a very long time, not because it was entirely wrong from a diplomatic standpoint, but because it perfectly reflected the Vatican's traditional strategy to act quietly behind the scenes, to remain publicly neutral, yet to offer discreet support to the side it believed was just. In Chile, during the brutal rule of Augusto Pinochet, the archives show long periods of public silence punctuated by moments of intense, indirect pressure. A fully recorded transcript of a private meeting between Cardinal Angelo Sodano and Chilean military leaders include a message expressing grave concern that the church was being perceived as a refuge for enemies of the regime. At the very same time, other records confirm that the Vatican actively protected priests who were sheltering political fugitives, not by any public decree, but through internal memos requesting the reinstatement of bishops who had been dismissed for being sympathetic to the opposition. The Cold War also brought incredibly complex dynamics to the Vatican's relationship with the Soviet Union. Although Catholicism was heavily persecuted in Soviet territories, the Vatican painstakingly maintained discreet channels of communication. A typed report, dated March 12, 1962, details a confidential meeting between an unofficial Vatican envoy and a representative of Khrushchev's government in Vienna. The conversation was not explosive. They discussed matters of religious freedom and the safety of clergy. But the very fact that this meeting occurred sent a clear and powerful message. The Vatican was willing to talk, even with its ideological archenemy, if it could save lives and preserve the flickering flame of faith. It is important to acknowledge that the Vatican did not always stand on the side of what we might now consider justice, at least not in the overt way the outside world often hopes for. In the case of Spain under Francisco Franco, the Vatican maintained full diplomatic relations with the dictatorship for decades. Some scholars call this a necessary compromise with authoritarianism in order to protect the faithful. Letters preserved in the archive show that bishops could, and did, disagree privately, but ultimately, they followed the orders that came from above. For a long time, I imagine the Vatican archives would be filled with mystical secrets, lost ancient scriptures, or perhaps even legendary relics. But after years of quiet study, I have come to understand something far more profound. The most shocking discoveries are not things that lie beyond history, but truths that are all too real, all too political, and all too close to the world that still surrounds us today. These are truths that many people would rather not confront. The Vatican is not some supernatural force. It is a political religious entity that operates with its own logic, its own strategy, and its own careful calculations. And its archives, far more than the stained glass windows or the holy statues, are the place where this complex and often uncomfortable reality is laid bare in its most unvarnished and honest form. Of all the rooms I have ever entered inside the vast expanse of the Vatican archives, none has ever left me as profoundly silent as the one marked Pius XII, that name, tied to the Pope who reigned from 1939 to 1958, a period that aligned almost perfectly with the Second World War and the post-war era, remains at the very center of one of the most enduring and painful debates in modern history. Did the Vatican do enough, say enough, or did it remain silent for far too long in the face of the 20th century's most brutal genocide? For decades, the records relating to Pius XI's pontificate were hermetically sealed, a decision that deeply divided historians around the world. Some have called him Hitler's Pope or the Pope of Silence. Others defend him as a cautious and pragmatic diplomat, one who was forced into a public silence in order to preserve lives that outspoken words could never have saved. Then, in 2020, when the Vatican officially declassified a portion of the documents from his papacy, a wave of astonishment, mixed with confirmation and fresh controversy, swept through the scholarly world. I was among the very few who were present in the archives when those materials were first made available. I remember with perfect clarity the first time I unfolded a file titled simply L'attività del Santo Padre durante il conflitto, the activities of the Holy Father during the conflict. Inside were letters, detailed reports, and telegrams, many of them sent from bishops in Germany, Poland, and Hungary between 1941 and 1944. One letter from the Archbishop of Lviv, dated March 16, 1942, described in stark terms how more than 1,000 Jewish residents have been expelled from the town without any formal charges or official sentence. At the end of his letter, he pleaded with the Vatican to intervene, or at the very least, to speak out against the injustice. The Vatican's response, attached just behind his letter, consisted of only a few lines. "We share in the sorrow, but prayer is the most powerful weapon we possess at this moment." It was not an outright refusal to help, but it was clearly not an action strong enough to halt the horror that was unfolding across the continent. There was a thick folder marked separately, titled Richieste di Aiuto e Asilo, Requests for Help and Asylum. Inside were hundreds of personal appeals from Jewish individuals, priests, scholars, and even artists writing directly to the Holy See, begging for protection. Some were indeed assisted, hidden away in convents, aided by brave nuns, or given forged documents that identified them as Catholics to help them escape detection by German forces. But many others received no reply at all. One particular page froze me in place. It was a handwritten list of 44 names. Beside each name were their addresses, their religions, their ages, and a small note. Sheltered at the Santa Brigida convent, the document was dated October 10th, 1943, just 3 days after German forces began rounding up the Jews of Rome. Of the 44 people on that list, cross-reference records show that only 12 survived the war. And then there's a detail that very few people know, something visible only to those who have read the actual pages themselves. Between 1942 and 1944, the Vatican sent multiple communiques to the German embassy in Rome, formally requesting a reduction in the persecution of people in areas where Catholic Jews resided. These letters were never made public. They contained no strong language, no use of the word crime, and certainly no mention of genocide. Instead, they spoke in the cool, detached language of diplomacy, citing concerns for social stability and the need to safeguard the sacred right to life. Perhaps that was the only viable language left to them in that moment. But for future generations, that caution has remained a profound source of sorrow and unending debate. The archive also preserves an entire chapter on the post-war appeals from Jewish communities. In 1945, a delegation representing European Jewry wrote to the Holy See, asking for confirmation that Catholic institutions had sheltered Jewish children during the war and formally requesting that those children now be returned to any surviving relatives. The Vatican's official response was, "We will permit it, but only if the children choose freely to leave their current environment." But many of these children were only 5 or 6 years old at the time. Most of them remembered nothing beyond the convent walls and the new faith into which they had been recently baptized. That deep moral wound would remain open for many years to come. Among the thousands of pages, I came across a draft of a speech that was never delivered, one that had been prepared for Easter of 1943. In it, a single line read, "We cannot close our eyes to the cries of a people cast out. Though they do not bear the name of Christ, they are still human beings." That line never reached the public. The final version of the speech was heavily revised, and that powerful passage was removed. No explanation was ever provided. Only a red stamp remained on the original draft. Asterisk reservado. Non divulgare asterisco. Reserved. Do not publish. What I saw does not give me the right to draw easy conclusions. I was not in their place. I did not carry the immense weight of a global institution during a time of total war. But I understand now why so many people refer to the Vatican archives as a place of delayed truths. It is not because those truths were ever lost, but because for a very long time, no one was truly ready to face them. People often think of the Vatican as an exclusively Western institution, inextricably tied to the history of Europe and the trajectory of Christianity on the old continent. But the documents buried deep within the archives reveal something profoundly different. From a very early stage, the Vatican possessed a vision that reached far beyond its European borders, a gaze directed towards the East. And it was within those yellowed, fragile pages that I first began to comprehend the true scale of the Church's missionary ambitions, its complex attempts at dialogue, and the profound, often conflicting encounters between Catholicism and the ancient civilizations of Asia. One section of the archives is titled simply Missiones Orientales, Easter Missions. It contains thousands of documents dating from the 16th to the 20th centuries. Written in Latin, Italian, French, and even classical Chinese and Japanese, these texts chronicle centuries of European missionaries traveling eastward, carrying with them not only the Bible, but also the values of an entirely different world. I began my exploration with a file labeled Simply China, Lettere dei Gesuiti. It is a collection of letters sent by Jesuit priests to the Vatican from China between the years 1580 and 1773. Among them, the writings of Matteo Ricci stand out with particular brilliance. He was the first Westerner to ever enter the Forbidden City. In his letters, Ricci expresses profound admiration for the Confucian moral system and boldly proposes that the Vatican should adapt Catholic doctrine to Chinese culture rather than trying to impose it. Not everyone agreed with this approach. The archives record fierce and lengthy debates within the Vatican that lasted for decades, centered on the question of whether Chinese converts should be permitted to continue their ancestral rites alongside their newfound Catholic faith. Eventually, Pope Clement XI issued a decree forbidding what became known as the Chinese Rites. This single decision severely damaged relations with the Qing dynasty, and by 1721, all missionary activity in China was completely banned. Another file, classified under highly confidential diplomacy, contains documents on Vatican-Japan relations. Among them is a letter written in elegant Chinese characters from Tokugawa Ieyasu in 1610. Translated and preserved with remarkable directness, it states, "Your religion disrupts the internal order. It divides fathers from sons, masters from servants. I do not allow it." What followed was a long and tragic series of reports detailing mass executions of Catholics in Nagasaki, priests being burned alive, and churches being systematically demolished. Yet, even from those fragmented and sorrowful accounts, I read stories of astonishing resilience. There were handwritten letters from imprisoned Japanese believers, smuggled to the Vatican via Portuguese trading ships, some of them written in their own blood on scraps of cloth. There was no mysticism in these letters, no dramatization, only the raw voices of human beings who believed in something greater than themselves and who ultimately paid the highest price for that belief. Then I entered a different world, the documents relating to Vietnam. The historical current here had its own distinct character, caught between East and West, between faith and sovereignty, between mission and politics. One file from 1790 preserved a letter from Bishop Pignot de Béhaine to the Vatican, in which he reported his efforts to help Prince Nguyen, who would later become Emperor Jialong, rebuild his forces and reclaim the throne. That letter was not just a simple missionary report. It was living evidence that Catholicism had played a direct role in shaping modern Vietnamese statehood, not merely as a foreign religion, but as an active agent in the process of nation-building. But the archives also meticulously record the darker chapters, the anti-Christian edicts of the Nguyen dynasty, the brutal executions of believers, and the desperate pleas sent back to Rome from missionaries on the ground. One document from 1833 recounts the Lu Van Khoi Rebellion, which was noted to have some support from Catholic communities and the Vatican's cautious and calculated reaction. We must not allow faith to become entangled with rebellion. That single line reflected a quiet, persistent tension between the desire to protect the faithful and the fear of being drawn into uncontrollable local conflicts. In the 20th century, the Vatican-Vietnam relationship grew even more complex. One file, covering the period from 1954 to 1975, is dense with reports on Catholic life in the North, the mass migration of Catholics to the South, and the influence of the Saigon government in episcopal appointments. A letter from Pope Pius XII to President Ngo Dinh Diem offered blessings, but also carried a subtle, cautionary message. A national leader has the duty not only to defend the faith, but to ensure justice for all his subjects. It was one of the few documents I found written in a tone that was both supportive and wary at the same time. What troubled me most, perhaps, was a special file documenting the failed efforts to restore diplomatic relations between the Vatican and the Socialist Republic of Vietnam after 1975. Internal notes reveal the Vatican's incredible patience, its repeated offers for dialogue, and its persistent hope to re-establish a humanitarian channel. But every single meeting ended at the level of polite formality. A memorandum from 1989 reads simply, "We must wait." Patience is part of the mission. Even in the pages that remained silent, I could feel the immense weight of history. Every letter, every crimson seal was more than just administrative paper. It was a trace of the long and difficult interaction between civilizations. The Vatican did not always act rightly, nor did it ever fully understand the East. But the presence of thousands of documents on Asia, preserved at the very heart of the Vatican, is proof of something deeper. This was never a separate world. It has always been a living, breathing, and enduring part of a single, shared global history. I once thought of the Vatican as a perfectly unified whole, an immaculate organizational pyramid with no room for internal dissent or disagreement. But it was only when I ventured deep within the archives that I began to truly understand. The Vatican is also a living entity, an organism filled with disputes, contradictions, and at times, silent but fierce struggles among those who wear the white robes of spiritual authority. One section of the archive is marked Sub Secreto Pontificio, under papal secrecy. It contains the records of discreet but intense confrontations between popes and their cardinals, or even between former popes and their successors. These documents are never made public while the individuals involved are still living. They are only archived long after those events have passed into the annals of history, or after the people in question have left their office. A particularly revealing set of files documents the palpable tension between Pope Paul VI and Cardinal Giuseppe Siri, who was once considered a leading candidate for the papacy himself. During the Second Vatican Council, Siri vehemently opposed almost every aspect of modernizing the Church, from replacing Latin with vernacular languages during Mass to engaging in dialogue with other religions. Internal records show that he wrote privately and frequently to Paul VI, denouncing what he saw as the dismantling of the sacred. The Pope's reply was only 2 lines long, but it was unmistakably cold. The shepherd cannot wait for the hesitation of the gatekeeper. The disagreements extended far beyond theology. The Vatican also bore deep and painful fractures in its financial governance. One of the most scandalous and thoroughly documented episodes in the archives is the Vatican bank crisis involving the Istituto per l'Opera di Religione, or IWAR, in the late 1970s and early 1980s. I still remember holding a thick, typewritten dossier, nearly 600 pages long, titled simply Caso Calvi. It refers to the case of Roberto Calvi, an Italian banker who was found hanged under London's Blackfriars Bridge in 1982. The press had nicknamed him God's banker due to his extremely close ties to the Vatican Bank. His death was officially ruled a suicide, but the documents preserved in the Vatican archives tell a far more complicated and shadowy story. Inside were bank statements, letters exchanged between the IWAR and Banco Ambrosiano, records of highly suspicious loans, and detailed lists of accounts held by front organizations in Panama. A handwritten memo from a concerned bishop voiced a grave concern. "We are using sacred assets for activities that are dangerously close to sin," but his warning was ignored. The files also document internal efforts to reorganize records in order to prevent a legal investigation by the Italian authorities. At least 3 documents were labeled Destruger, to be destroyed for reasons that remain unknown. They were never destroyed. Equally sensitive is the file on the Vatileaks scandal of 2012, which involved the leaking of numerous confidential Vatican documents. Many people still remember the name Paolo Gabriele, the personal butler of Pope Benedict XVI, who copied and smuggled out a vast number of private files. In the archives, a dedicated box preserves the full timeline of the incident, from the initial internal investigation to Gabrielle's own handwritten confession. In it, he wrote, "I did not betray the Holy Father. I only wanted the Church to know what was truly happening behind its closed doors." The leaked documents revealed severe internal divisions within the Roman Curia, competing factions, rival interest groups, and intense power struggles over influence and control. Many of the papers exposed financial favoritism, corruption in ecclesiastical appointments, and concerted efforts to suppress scandals involving ethical and even criminal behavior. Every single line was a fracture in the foundation of public trust. The fact that the Vatican chose to prosecute Gabriele in an open court was a rare and surprising sign that the centuries-old wall of silence had finally begun to crack. I once asked a senior priest who managed the archives, "Why does the Vatican preserve documents that could so clearly harm its own reputation?" He smiled a sad, knowing smile, then replied with a sentence I have never forgotten. "Because the truth does not belong to us. It only passes through us." The Vatican archives do not attempt to erase the past. They preserve it, sometimes in silence, sometimes in sorrow, as an unspoken and ongoing act of accountability. And that, far more than any statue of saint, is what makes this place so profoundly human. A space where power, faith, and failure are indelibly recorded in ink, not in water. There's something that very few people know. Not every meeting between a head of state and the Pope is publicly announced. To the outside world, the press office releases only a few carefully selected photographs of handshakes and a brief, diplomatic statement about mutual understanding, cooperation, and peace. But in the Vatican archives, I found the handwritten records of what was truly said behind those closed doors. Exchanges that were sometimes blunt, sometimes deeply emotional, occasionally marked by sharp disagreement, and always transcribed with meticulous care in ink that was designed to last for centuries. One of the most striking files contains a record of the meeting between Pope Pius XI and Nazi Germany's ambassador to the Holy See, Diego von Bergen, in 1939. This took place just after Hitler had invaded Czechoslovakia, and tensions with Poland were rapidly escalating. In the internal note of the meeting, the Pope did not issue a direct condemnation, but he asked a pointed and chilling question. Does your government still control the hatred it has sown within German society? The ambassador did not provide a direct answer. The file concludes with the remark, "The atmosphere turned markedly cold." There was no closing prayer. It is a small detail, yet it speaks volumes. Turning to the 1960s, I came across the record of a meeting in 1965 between Pope Paul VI and the Soviet Foreign Minister, Andrei Gromyko. In public, the meeting was hailed as a historic effort to reopen dialogue between the East and the West. But in the archival transcript, the scribe noted a tense exchange. The Soviet delegation stated that religion is a tool for distorting historical truth. Pope Paul VI responded gently, but with an iron firmness: no one can forbid another from believing in the sacred. That is not an exercise of power. It is a fundamental part of the human soul. Then, without any further comment, he invited the entire Soviet delegation to stand in silence for 1 minute in honor of all the unknown souls who had died for their ideals. The Soviet side never once mentioned this gesture in any of its official records. Another notable set of files is titled simply USA, Visite Reservate, United States, Unpublished Visits. Inside are notes from private meetings between various popes and American presidents, from Roosevelt and Eisenhower to Kennedy, Reagan, and George W. Bush. One entry records a poignant moment from Pope John XCI's meeting with President John F. Kennedy in 1963. President Kennedy expressed his deep concern over the ever-present risk of nuclear conflict following the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Holy Father asked him a simple question: who will remain calm first when the world no longer has a moral foundation to stand on? Strangely, both men had very little time left after that meeting. Pope John XCI passed away just a few months later, and President Kennedy was assassinated at the end of that same year. The file draws no direct connection between these events, but the chilling proximity of their fates led some archivists to mark that particular file as especially sensitive. It is not only global superpowers that are represented in these records. I once came across an old, faded file on a meeting between Pope John Paul II and General Secretary Gorbachev in 1989, just before the fall of the Berlin Wall. Gorbachev was not a religious man, but in the meeting record he is quoted as saying, "If we do not change, there will be nothing left to preserve." John Paul II answered him with a single prophetic line: "Truth rises when people grow weary." After that conversation, the Vatican became one of the first institutions in the world to foresee the complete unraveling of the Eastern Bloc. Some of the most surprising documents I found came from smaller nations or from countries without long-standing diplomatic ties to the Vatican. In a file marked Vietnam, colloqui non officiali, I found an internal memo from 1991. An unofficial Vatican delegation had held talks with representatives of the Vietnamese government in Geneva. No formal agreement was reached, but a willingness to continue the dialogue was expressed. This was one of the earliest, quietest steps toward restoring contact after the end of the war in 1975. It happened not through splashy media headlines, but through quiet, handwritten words recorded in silence. The Vatican has no military power and no vast economy. But what I came to understand after reading these countless records is this: when a world leader seeks sincerity or counsel unburdened by political gain, they often come to the Holy See. And the Vatican knows this very well. It rarely needs to speak loudly, because every single page it preserves has the potential power to reshape the understanding of an entire generation, if it is revealed at precisely the right moment. One of the things that truly sets the Vatican apart from every other religious institution in the world is this: it is not only a church, it is also a sovereign state. It can sign international treaties, issue diplomatic communiques, and can even be sued in a court of law. And it is within one of the least discussed sections of the Vatican archives, a section labeled Causa Juridicae, that I encountered a very different and far more worldly side of the Holy See. In these pages, the language is no longer that of prayer and theology, but of cold, hard legal argument. Few would ever expect the Vatican, that sacred and holy place, to be brought before a court of law. But in reality, since the early 20th century, there have been hundreds of legal disputes involving the Vatican, both internally and with foreign governments. One thick file details the famous legal conflict between the Vatican and the Italian government that followed the signing of the Lateran Treaty in 1929. The issue is not merely about borders or political privileges, but about the ownership of hundreds of buildings, churches, and monasteries scattered across Italy. One internal memorandum clearly states, "We cannot allow sacred ground to become negotiable property, but neither can we allow it to be nationalized without condition." The negotiations dragged on for years, at times threatening to erupt into a full-blown diplomatic crisis. The Vatican had to prove legal ownership of property that dated back to the medieval period, often using original documents drawn from these very archives, documents written in ancient Latin and signed by popes as far back as the 12th century. Thanks to that historical evidence, many Catholic properties in Italy still retain their legal inviolability today. But perhaps the most painful and deeply unsettling documents of all are those relating to the cases of sexual abuse within the Church, a crisis that erupted into global public view in the early 2000s. Filed under a highly sensitive category marked Casus Disciplinaires Reservati, confidential disciplinary cases, I read documents that no seminary had ever prepared me to expect. One file detailed an internal investigation from 1962 in a North American diocese. The victim was a minor. The perpetrator was a priest who had already been reported multiple times. But in the memo that came from above, the directive was clear. Transfer this individual to another parish. Do not make the matter public. Avoid scandal for the community. No warning was ever issued to the next congregation. Years later, the same horrific offense occurred again. This was not an isolated case. Similar files appear from Ireland, Germany, Argentina, and the Philippines, some detailing cases that were never covered by the media. Letters from victims reached the Vatican, sometimes handwritten with a trembling script. One read, "I don't know who else will listen. Please don't pretend that nothing happened." Some of these letters received no reply. Others were labeled for internal review. The Vatican has never denied that the abuse occurred, but for decades, it approached the issue as an institutional crisis to be managed, not simply as a matter of individual crime to be punished. Since 2001, the Holy See has implemented stricter disciplinary procedures, and many files document that gradual, agonizing shift. Yet what truly silenced me was the unbearable slowness of that change. In a 2010 report, one bishop acknowledged, "We were so afraid of creating scandal that we forgot who it was we were supposed to protect." Beyond the abuse cases, the Vatican has also faced numerous international lawsuits over disputed assets, particularly in the aftermath of World War II. One file from 1997 documents a case brought by the descendants of Jewish families, alleging that the Church held gold and other valuables that had been looted by the Nazis. The Vatican formally denied responsibility, but the file remains archived under the heading Unresolved Claims. Another highly sensitive case involves the Vatican Museums, which house tens of thousands of artifacts from across the globe, including many items that originated in countries once under colonial rule. In one petition from the government of Peru, they requested the return of a ceremonial Incan mask. The Vatican responded with a formal statement. This artifact is a record of history. It carries no ownership value, but belongs to the memory of humankind. The matter was left unresolved, like so many others. The archive never offers its own conclusions. It only preserves the evidence. But as you read through hundreds of legal briefs, lawsuits, desperate pleas, and carefully worded replies, you come to understand that the Vatican is not removed from the world, is inextricably drawn into it, layer by layer, by the very nature of being a human institution. And when humans err, even when they're dressed in white robes, the paper records remain impartial, emotionless, but ultimately impossible to deny. There's a section within the Vatican archives that even many Catholic scholars have never been granted access to, not because it is the most heavily guarded, but because it demands a very particular and rare kind of knowledge: Koine Greek, ancient Hebrew, and the specific Latin of the early Church. This place is known informally as the First Manuscripts Room, a chamber that holds the very foundational texts of Christian belief. ancient Bibles, the earliest translations, and even the writings that were deliberately excluded during the formation of the scripture we know today. The first time I entered that section, I hardly dared to breathe, not out of fear, but from a profound sense of reverence. I was standing amidst millennia of handwriting, painstakingly inscribed by hand on animal parchment, with ink made from ash, roots, and perhaps even the tears of those who believed their words were divine in origin. Tucked away inside a worn wooden drawer was a copy of the Codex Vaticanus, one of the oldest surviving Greek Bibles, dating back to the 4th century. Its text is not identical to the printed Bibles we are familiar with today. Some well-known passages are missing, others differ significantly in their wording, and remarkably, there are entire sections of narrative that no longer appear in the modern canon. A striking example is the ending of the Gospel of Mark. Modern versions typically conclude with Jesus appearing to his disciples after the resurrection. But in the Codex Vaticanus, that triumphant conclusion is absent. The text ends abruptly and chillingly with the words, "And they were afraid." This single difference has long stirred intense scholarly debate. Is the widely known ending a later addition, added to provide a more hopeful conclusion? And the Codex is not alone. In a small metal cabinet secured with 3 separate locks, I once saw a folder labeled Evangelia Apocrypha, the apocryphal Gospels that were excluded from the official scripture. Among them were the Gospels of Thomas, Mary Magdalene, and Philip, writings that were rediscovered at Nag Hammadi in Egypt in 1945, though the Vatican possessed copies long before that discovery. The Gospel of Thomas, for instance, consists of 114 sayings attributed to Jesus, but they are arranged without any narrative structure. One saying reads, "The kingdom of God is within you and all around you." If those words truly came from Christ, they raise profound theological questions about the necessity of the Church as an intermediary between humanity and the divine. Perhaps it was for this very reason that such texts were never canonized. Even more controversial is the Acta Pilati, the Acts of Pilate. This document presents the Roman governor's supposed defense of himself after he ordered the crucifixion of Jesus. In it, Pilate describes Christ as a man unlike any who had ever lived, whose eyes shone like fire and whose words flowed like living water. The highly mythical tone of this account may explain its exclusion from the official New Testament. Yet, its mere presence in the archive reveals that even Roman officials once tried to make sense of the crucifixion in their own language and in their own way. Beyond these ancient texts, the archives preserve countless letters exchanged between medieval popes and major theologians, letters that capture intense debates over whether certain books, such as the Revelation of Enoch, the Book of Wisdom, or the Maccabees, should be included in the Bible. In one letter from Pope Damasus I, he wrote, "We do not reject them for their falsehood, but because the hearts of men are not yet ready for them." That single sentence has haunted me ever since. How much of what we call Scripture is pure divine truth, and how much is the result of human decisions made under immense historical pressure? Another record details a closed session of the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, the first major gathering of Christian bishops from across the Roman Empire to formalize church doctrine. The minutes of this council include a long list of texts that were discussed, many of which no longer exist today. A side note from a Greek scribe reads, "Certain writings are to be retained for deeper theological study, not for public reading. This suggests that they were not destroyed, but merely withheld, and may still rest in locked drawers like the ones that were before me." The archive does not declare what is right or what is wrong. It remains silent, preserving every interpretation, every variation, and every fracture in the long and complicated history of belief. Some may find that deeply unsettling, but I do not. For what makes faith resilient is not its perfect uniformity, but its ability to survive debate, revision, and even profound doubt. To the outside world, the Pope is a symbol of absolute steadiness, the direct successor of St. Peter, the living embodiment of continuity and unwavering Catholic faith. But within the Vatican archives, hidden behind private files, secret correspondence, and unpublished personal notes, lies something that few would ever dare to imagine. The Pope is human. They have experienced fear, they have harbored doubts, and, at times, they have collapsed under the immense weight of events far beyond their control. I still remember the first time I came across a folder titled literally Non Inviati, Letters Never Sent. Inside were handwritten drafts by several popes, letters that were never printed and never answered. These were not diplomatic missives or official decrees. They read like pages from a private diary, where men at the very pinnacle of spiritual authority wrote down the words they could not bring themselves to say aloud. One of the most haunting was a letter by Pope Benedict XV, written in 1917 at the height of the First World War. It was addressed to the leaders of Europe, pleading with them for a ceasefire so that humanity might not lose its soul entirely to the thunder of artillery. But the letter was never sent. A note in the margin, written by the Cardinal Secretary of State at the time, read simply, "No one will listen. And if they do not listen, your holiness will appear weak." The letter was folded neatly and shelved, forgotten, until I stumbled upon it more than a century later. Another file was marked Reservatum Pro Conclavi, reserved for the conclave. It contained materials written by some popes specifically for their successors. These documents were never intended to be made public. They were meant only to be read by the College of Cardinals during a papal election. One such memorandum, 12 pages long, was penned by Pope Pius XI in 1938, just as the Nazis were consolidating their power and anti-Jewish laws were spreading across Europe. In that memorandum, the Pope expressed his deep concern that parts of the German Church had begun to silently cooperate with the fascist regime. He warned his future successor, "If we remain silent, history will not speak of our wisdom. It will speak of our complicity." That powerful document was never read by the conclave. Pius XI died shortly before he could issue a public encyclical condemning anti-Semitism. The memorandum remained in the archive, sealed and silent. One file left me standing motionless for a very long time. It held the records concerning Pope John Paul I, who served for only 33 days before his sudden death in 1978. Many conspiracy theories have swirled around that event, but in the archives, there was no evidence of intrigue, only the cold, hard truth of internal memos showing that the new pope had been preparing a sweeping reform of the Vatican's financial administration. This included major changes to the Vatican Bank and a thorough review of secret accounts that were linked to Italian financial institutions. In one of his own handwritten notes, he wrote, "The Church cannot preach purity if it is not transparent itself." That line was underlined 3 times. But he never had the chance to act on it. And in a meeting record from a session held shortly after his death, one cardinal is recorded as saying, "We must continue the mission, but we must not touch the structural foundations." That single sentence has echoed in my mind ever since. Even beloved and long-reigning popes like John Paul II and Francis have left behind handwritten letters that are heavy with emotion. One unpublished draft by John Paul II, written during the height of the abuse scandal, shows his clear inner conflict. "I do not know if I have done enough. Every night, I pray not only for forgiveness from God, but from the victims I have never met." His handwriting was simple and clear, but the words were as weighty as the papal tiara he wore for over 2 decades. Pope Francis, known for his reformist spirit and his message of closeness to the people, also has letters that have never been made public. One was addressed to a cardinal who had been convicted of abuse. In it, he wrote, "The sin of an individual does not destroy the Church, but the covering up of that sin does." An attached memo revealed that a fierce internal debate continues to this day within the Vatican over the delicate boundaries of forgiveness and transparency in the modern age. The Vatican archives never speak aloud, but its pages, yellowed, trembling, and never seen by the public, carry a weight that no press release could ever convey. They reveal that beneath the brilliant glow of authority, the chair of Peter is also a profoundly solitary journey. And even the head of the Church has sleepless nights, just like any other soul in the world. When people speak of the Vatican, they think of churches, rituals, and faith. But few think of telegrams, intelligence reports, or financial contracts with foreign banks. And yet, it is precisely these seemingly secular elements that occupy a considerable part of the deepest layers of the Vatican archives, where the Holy See's unofficial ties with worldly powers have been recorded, line by line, for centuries. One of the first folders that left me stunned bore the simple title Cantate Riservati, Intelligence. It contained documents detailing secret communications between the Vatican and Western intelligence agencies during the Cold War, particularly with the CIA and MI6. In one memo, dated June 17, 1953, just weeks after the coup in Iran, a CIA representative in Rome met with a Vatican cardinal to discuss anti-communist developments in the Middle East. The report was brief and to the point. The Holy See is morally supportive, will not intervene directly, but is willing to encourage local churches to promote democratic values in opposition to atheism. No formal agreement was ever signed, but the message was crystal clear. The Vatican was not merely observing the world. It possessed the moral stature to influence the flow of ideologies, especially through the vast network of its faith. Another memo from 1979 records a secret meeting between a CIA operative and Vatican officials shortly before Pope John Paul II's historic first visit to his homeland in Poland. The CIA expressed a particular interest in whether the Polish Pope could inspire the burgeoning solidarity movement. The Vatican made no promises, but the memo noted, "We are aware of our role, but the gospel is not a strategic tool. It was a classic diplomatic response, neither agreeing nor denying, yet leaving ample room for silent, decisive action." Another set of files, labeled Relazioni Riservate, is real, documents clandestine contacts between the Vatican and Mossad, Israel's formidable intelligence agency. The correspondence includes Vatican requests for the protection of Christian holy sites in Jerusalem amid escalating tensions between Jews and Palestinians. A Mossad report sent back to the Vatican stated bluntly, "We do not care about the religion of the persons standing in a sanctuary. So long as they are not hiding weapons." The Vatican's reply was terse but telling, "We do not hide weapons. We preserve memory." The next layer I encountered had nothing to do with espionage, but everything to do with finance. A folder titled Banca e Potera, Banking and Power, chronicled the Vatican's relationships with numerous international financial institutions, including the infamous Banco Ambrosiano, UBS of Switzerland, and various financial entities in Panama. The files contained wire transfer records and documentation of investments in real estate across London, Paris, and even in resort properties in South America. An internal report from 1985 notes, "A portion of investment returns will be redirected to the charitable funds of the Holy See." No public disclosure is required. The concern was not that the Vatican was investing its money, but that it was using shell companies and complex financial structures to avoid scrutiny. Some accounts were listed under the names of pastoral foundations, but were actually managed by the financial directors of private banks. There were no direct signs of abuse in the files I saw, but the entire structure was so opaque that tracing the flow of funds was nearly impossible. And perhaps that was precisely the intent. What surprised me even more was a small, unnumbered, and unstamped folder bearing only a handwritten title, Rapporti non ufficiali, Fraternita Riservate. This was a record of confidential encounters between high-ranking Vatican officials and representatives of Western secret societies, including the Freemasons, a group long condemned by the Catholic Church. One memo, dated 1969, records a bishop in Switzerland meeting with a senior Freemason of the European Lodge to explore possibilities for dialogue on human rights and freedom of conscience. No firm conclusions were reached, but notably, official Vatican policy began to shift thereafter, moving from outright prohibition to a more cautious stance of discouraging participation, thereby creating a gray area in doctrine that allowed for interfaith dialogue with groups once branded as heretical. I found no evidence of a grand conspiracy or of Vatican manipulation of world events. But what I saw clearly was that the Vatican does not live in isolation. It maintains a vast and complex network that is not declared, not publicized, but has been quietly active for centuries. And its archives preserve every handshake, every letter, and every unofficial meeting, as if to remind us that history does not truly happen on the brightly lit stage, but in the shadows of the wings behind the curtain. When one enters the Vatican, the first thing they usually notice is the light that streams through the stained glass windows, the light that reflects off the gilded brilliance of the Sistine Chapel, the light from the flickering candles and shimmering statues in the grand basilicas. But few are aware that alongside that radiant light, there exists another realm, one of profound silence, condensation, and rituals so intricate and ancient that it borders on the mystical. And in the Vatican archives, what unsettled me most was not the political documentation, but the records of the rituals themselves. These are manuscripts that have never left the stone walls of the Vatican, texts read aloud perhaps only once in a century, then locked away behind drawers secured with 3 heavy brass latches. One of the most astonishing documents I ever encountered was a handwritten manual titled Ordo Rituum Conclavis. It consisted of over 80 pages detailing the precise sequence of steps in organizing a papal conclave. The original may not be copied or publicly released. It is not merely a description of a process. It is a living document containing whispered prayers, specific sealing rituals for the doors of the Sistine Chapel, and even coded signals used among officials to ensure that no information escapes the proceedings. A particularly striking section records the oath of the ceremoniere segreto, the secret master of ceremonies, who is tasked with upholding absolute silence during the conclave. The oath itself is not fully written out, showing only its opening line. I swear before God and the shadow of St. Peter. The rest is transcribed in an abbreviated Latin code, intelligible only to the innermost circle. A note in the margin reads, "Should this oath be broken, every prayer uttered within this sanctuary will lose its virtue." Whether one interprets that as symbolic or literal, the sheer gravity of that sentence was impossible to ignore. Another document I came across was labeled "to be used only when there is no pope," Ordo Exequiarum Pontificis Maximi, the internal protocol following the death of a pontiff. It details every single moment, from who is allowed to enter the papal chambers first, to who seals the doors of the papal apartment, to the exact sequence for the public announcement. One passage in particular sent a chill through me. Before announcing the death to the world, the Camerlengo shall call the popes, named 3 times in Latin, through the closed door. If no response is heard, he shall then declare the Holy Father deceased. It is not merely a ritual. It is the final, solemn symbol of both supreme authority and ultimate mortality. I also came across a short manual reserved for an extremely rare event. Canonizatio Extraordinaria, the extraordinary canonization of a saint outside the usual, lengthy process. Only 8 pages long, it contains strange and specific prescriptions. The relic must be a non-decomposable element. The ceremony must last for precisely 3 hours, no more and no less. And the individual who proclaims the title of saint must have a direct blood or spiritual bond with the saint community. Whether these ancient rules are still enforced is unclear, but the document remains untouched and unaltered. One of the least known files was titled De Symbolis Non Publicis, on non-public symbols. It catalogs the secret symbols, items, and colors used by the Vatican in urgent or exceptional situations. For example, a red cord tied diagonally across the door of a Vatican chamber signifies that the room is undergoing theological deliberation, meaning a doctrinal crisis is currently under discussion. Or a bottle of deep brown ink, known as ink of silence, is to be used only to write text that will never be made public. Each symbol is accompanied by detailed explanations in archaic Latin, understood only by the highest ranks of the clergy. But what haunted me most was a thin, black, leather-bound book with no title, marked only with a date. 3 Aprilis MCMXLV, April 3rd, 1945. Inside was a ritual that was never enacted, one prepared for the dire scenario in which Rome fell into the hands of either fascist forces or the Soviet Red Army. It outlined in precise detail how to seal the most holy relics, how to destroy the most sensitive documents, and it described a rite called the Benedictio Ultima, the final blessing, to be performed only if Vatican sovereignty were to be completely lost. No one has read that blessing aloud since the day it was written, but it remains there in the shadows, waiting for a moment that the world prays will never arrive. The Vatican is a state, but it is also a ceremony. And within its archives, ritual is not merely an action. It is the very language of memory. Every written prayer, every crimson seal, every phrase spoken only once in centuries, they are all essential parts of this immense structure, not out of superstition, but out of the profound belief that in a world that changes by the day, some things must be preserved, if only to remind us that we once believed in something eternal. In a quiet corridor, tucked away in the northern basement of the Vatican archives, I stumbled upon an old wooden box carved with a single word, index. There was no seal, no guide, but inside lay a long and fraught history. The perpetual tension between knowledge and faith, preserved in its entirety by the Vatican itself. Every book title, every reason given for its prohibition, every internal debate that never reached the public eye. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, or list of prohibited books, was officially established in 1559 by Pope Paul IV at the height of the Counter-Reformation. It became the most powerful instrument of censorship the Holy See ever wielded for over 4 centuries. But what lies preserved in the archives is not just a simple list. It is the process, the deliberations, the heated arguments, and, at times, the deep contradictions among theologians, clergy, and even the popes themselves. In my hands, I held a yellowed, typewritten record from 1907, the minutes of a meeting of the Congregatio pro Doctrina Fidei, the office charged with safeguarding doctrine. In it, the members debated whether to add historian Ernest Renan's Vita Jesus, the life of Jesus, to the index. Some argued that Renan had blasphemed by portraying Jesus as a mere historical figure, not as a divine being. But one bishop opposed the ban, saying, "If we forbid him, we acknowledge his influence." The book was ultimately banned, but the argument remains preserved, revealing how censorship within the Church was not always unanimous, but was often a struggle between the defense of faith and the demands of the modern age. Another file, nearly 300 pages long, was labeled with a single line, Galileo Galilei. It contains every document tied to Galileo's trial. Not only the final sentence, but also handwritten pleas for leniency, notes from bishops who privately opposed his condemnation, and letters from later generations, including Pope John Paul II's formal acknowledgement of the Church's mistake in 1992. One record from 1633 reads, "We do not condemn science. We condemn the arrogance that seeks to rise above revelation." That sentence still echoes, especially today, as scientific theories once deemed dangerous, evolution, the Big Bang, are now accepted by the Vatican as not being incompatible with faith. Beyond books, the Church once maintained a specific body focused on art and media, which I later discovered had its own file titled Cinema et Fides, Cinema and Faith. This section contains detailed evaluations of films that were screened in Catholic countries from the 1920s through the 1980s. Some of the entries were unusual. A review of Fellini's La Dolce Vita noted it was excessively secular, but accurately portrays the emptiness of a world without God. The final conclusion was that it should be banned from Catholic schools, but not publicly condemned because a loud ban would only increase its appeal. Another folder records the Church's response to philosophical or allegorical literature. It includes a discussion of George Orwell's Star 1984 Star, which some clergy suspected of critiquing religious totalitarianism. But internal documents concluded this is a condemnation of secular totalitarianism. No response is necessary. It reveals that the Vatican censors were often subtle analysts, not just reactionary, but highly selective in their battles. Perhaps the most intriguing file of all was one marked Internal Circulation Only, Do Not Reproduce, detailing the Vatican's internal review of the Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown. Although many clergy publicly denounced the book, internal reports stated, its impact lies in exploiting the public's ignorance of religious rituals and symbols. The best response is not condemnation, but education. Rather than banning the book, the Vatican responded with a series of counterpublications, a strategic shift from censorship to engagement. The index was officially abolished in 1966, but the files remain, quiet, untouched, lined up on the Vatican shelves like a silent reminder. The greatest power lies not in outright prohibition, but in shaping how and when people receive an idea. And for centuries, the Vatican has not merely safeguarded the faith. It has carefully shaped the very threshold of human knowledge, deciding how far it should open, when, and to whom. When I stepped into the section labeled Crusade, an uncanny silence fell over everything around me. Gone were the 20th century maps, the diplomatic telegrams, and the polished dossiers exchanged between envoys. What remained were ancient parchment scrolls, blackened ink, and crimson wax seals that were once pressed between the fingers of the most powerful men in Europe. This was where the Vatican kept what remained from a time when faith was transformed into an instrument of war. The Crusades, carried out in the name of holiness, left behind stains of blood on the map of history that no amount of prayer could ever erase. One of the first documents I found was the original crusading bull of 1095, Deus Vult, God Wills It, issued by Pope Urban II at the Council of Clermont. Written in formal Latin, it begins with an urgent and passionate plea. The Holy Land has been seized. The blood of the faithful cries out from Jerusalem. The Catholic must march. There is no mention of a political agenda, no talk of land or wealth, only a clarion call to arms. And yet, that single call ignited more than 2 centuries of continuous warfare and claimed the lives of millions under the shadow of the cross. Subsequent documents, especially from the time of Pope Innocent III, show how the Crusades evolved into a highly structured campaign. They were no longer merely a spiritual appeal, but a complex logistical operation involving taxes, recruitment, supply chains, and specific rewards. I read letters exchanged between the Vatican and European lords discussing the number of knights, the amount of provisions, and most troubling of all, the right to seize the property of those who refuse to convert or to join the cause. A particularly striking document, dated 1204, records the Vatican's internal reaction to the Fourth Crusade, which, instead of reaching Jerusalem, ended up sacking Constantinople, the very heart of Eastern Orthodoxy. In the minutes penned by Cardinal Pietro Capuano, there is a chilling admission. We let the sword lead, not the spirit. We did not conquer heresy. We looted our brethren. Although Pope Innocent III issued a formal and restrained condemnation of the pillage, no reparations or apologies ever followed. But what haunted me most were not the wartime documents, but the post-war ones. A file titled Requiem Pro Error, a prayer for the error, preserves the Vatican's later reflections and acknowledgments of the past. Inside was an unpublished speech draft by Pope Paul VI, which was meant to be delivered during his 1964 visit to Istanbul. It reads, "We brought war into places that once knelt in prayer. We cannot claim this was God's will." The speech was withdrawn at the last moment and replaced with a far more neutral and diplomatic address. But the original remains here, preserved beneath layers of dust. The Vatican archives also preserve records of lesser-known crusades. The Northern Crusades against pagans in the Baltics, the Albigensian Crusade in southern France aimed at annihilating the Cathars, and even campaigns waged against disobedient Catholic monarchs. A record from the 13th century documents a bishop who refused to join a crusade, stating, "I do not see God in fire and blood." He was stripped of his office shortly thereafter. Still, the archives also bear witness to later efforts at dialogue and reconciliation. A folder titled Reconciliatio holds correspondence between the Holy See and the Orthodox churches of Russia, Greece, and Armenia, communities still deeply scarred by the memory of the Crusades. In a letter from 1999, Pope John Paul II wrote to the ecumenical patriarch Bartholomew, "If blood once divided us, let prayer begin to mend the wounds that history has left behind." It was not a public apology, but it was a beginning. In all of these documents, I did not find an evil or ruthless Vatican, but I did see an institution that once wielded faith as a justification for war, and that slowly, over many centuries, learned to reflect upon its own actions. None of these texts deny the past, but they do not whitewash the present either. The Vatican archives do not seek to justify. They preserve, with a solemn fidelity to memory, and with the quiet belief that the truth, however bitter it may be, is an essential part of redemption. One quiet, rainy afternoon, while I was searching for documents related to medieval church councils, an elderly archivist pointed me toward a small, solitary wooden box at the very end of a long shelf and said, "You should read this. This is where the church keeps what it never declared, yet could never bring itself to discard." Because even they knew that some women once helped to lay the very foundation of our faith, the box had no name, only a catalog number and a small, handwritten note. Mulieres in silentio, ecclesiae, women in the silence of the church. Inside was not a large trove of documents, but one that contained a quiet yet persistent current of history, a current the Vatican has never officially acknowledged, not because it was rebellious, but because it raised a question that remains unresolved to this day. What is the true place of women in a faith structure that has been ruled almost exclusively by men for nearly 2 millennia? I began with a set of handwritten letters from the 12th century by Hildegard von Bingen, a German nun, composer, theologian, and visionary. Most of her writings, in both Latin and Old German, recorded spiritual visions of profound theological and philosophical depth. In one letter to Pope Eugenius III, Hildegard wrote, "The soul of a woman is also breathed into being by God. So why must her voice pass only through the mouths of men?" Remarkably, the letter was not answered with condemnation, but with a calculated and deliberate silence. Still, Hildegard was not branded a heretic. On the contrary, several voices within the Roman Curia praised her, but they always kept her at a safe distance. In one internal record, I found the line, "This woman is not wrong, but the Church cannot yet permit women to teach from the pulpit." Her intellect was recognized, yet an invisible line remained, one that she and countless other women were never allowed to cross. Digging deeper, I found another file titled Monialium Scripturae, Writings of the Nuns. It was a collection of prayers, poems, and liturgical texts composed by women in religious orders from the 9th to the 16th centuries. Among them were prayers that were both graceful and defiant. One read, "I do not ask to be a priest. I ask only to tend the flame unseen, burning quietly in the darkest chapel corner." These words were never spoken in formal rites, but they were copied by hand, passed from nun to nun, their brown-black ink still visible on parchment that had been softened by the passage of time. The most haunting section, however, was the file on heresy investigations, particularly those that targeted women whose spiritual influence grew too large. A case from 1321 in southern France recorded the trial of a group of women who were accused of unauthorized preaching, though they had only held Bible readings and shared their personal interpretations of the texts. One interrogation transcript reads, "Do you believe that women can interpret the Word of God?" The woman, named Clara, replied, "If God chose a virgin to bear him, why would he not choose her tongue to proclaim him?" The record ends with a single chilling note. She was burned at the stake. And yet, not all of these voices were silenced. In the files from the Second Vatican Council, I found letters and internal minutes documenting serious discussions on expanding women's roles in the modern church. A handwritten note from Cardinal Sunens read, "It is not enough to bring more women into the church. We must admit that they have always been here." From 1965 onward, Vatican commissions began to include women as theological advisors. But, as one document explicitly stated, consultar non decidir. They may advise, but they do not decide. More recently, I came across the minutes from a 2016 meeting that discussed the possibility of female deacons. A group of female theologians presented historical evidence that deaconesses were recognized in the 1st to 3rd centuries in early Christian Greek texts. One cardinal pushed back, arguing that was not the same as ordination today, but another cardinal, whose name was redacted in the version I read, wrote, "If a truth must be hidden because our current structure cannot contain it, then the fault is not in the truth." That single sentence made me sit in silence for a very long time. The Vatican archives did not erase these women, but it has never placed them in the full light of day. They remain like slanted footnotes in the margins of history, not loud enough to echo from the pulpits, but strong enough to withstand the winds of time. And as I closed that old wooden box, I finally understood that the church was not built only of stone and of men. It was built with the hands of women who laundered the vestments, copied the sacred texts, raised generations of believers, and in profound silence, carried the flame of faith through its darkest centuries. The Vatican is often seen as a moral haven, a symbol of faith and forgiveness. But the truth is, wherever there are humans, there will be mistakes. And within the ancient stone walls that surround St. Peter's Square, those mistakes do not always come from the outside. Sometimes they come from within. In a section of the Vatican archives marked Delicta Reservata, reserved crimes, I began to explore a series of case files that had been sealed away for decades. There was nothing mystical about them. There were no curses, no dark conspiracies, only paperwork, signatures, and chillingly meticulous transcripts. These were the records of criminal acts committed within the very institution that preaches grace and virtue. One of the earliest files I encountered detailed a theft in 1969 from the Sacred Relics Repository, the chamber where hundreds of holy artifacts were stored, including the bones of saints, the robes of martyrs, and handwritten scriptures from early Christianity. According to the report, a young monk who had been assigned to clean the vault secretly took a small box that was believed to contain relics of St. Lawrence. He did not try to sell it. Instead, he kept it in his room, claiming that he could hear the saint whispering to him in his dreams. The Vatican held a closed trial. There were no journalists and no public announcements. The verdict was not criminal prosecution, but the monk was laicized and permanently expelled from Vatican territory. A note attached to the file read, "This action stemmed from misdirected faith, not from greed. Perhaps that was why mercy prevailed." Another case, far more serious, occurred in 1982. The murder of a teenage boy, a Vatican citizen, inside the Vatican gardens, mere meters from the Pope's office. The case file, labeled Caso AG 82, revealed that the victim was the son of a Vatican treasury employee. His body was found near the southern wall, with clear evidence of blunt force trauma to the head. The prime suspect was a gatekeeper with a history of mental instability. The internal investigation spanned over 400 pages, detailing every step of the interrogation and examination. The suspect was described as having lost control due to religious anxiety and psychological isolation. Yet, instead of being handed over to the Italian authorities, the Vatican dealt with the matter internally. The man was confined to a secluded monastic facility, completely cut off from the outside world, and he never faced a public trial. The final line of the report reads, "The peace of the faithful must be preserved more than the curiosity of the crowd." The Vatican operates under its own legal system, which is based on the Codex Iuris Canonici, or canon law. But since the 1929 Lateran Treaty, it has also selectively adopted parts of Italian law, especially in cases of severe criminal acts. Still, jurisdiction remains with the Vatican courts, where the judges are typically high-ranking clergy or cardinals. In the archives, I came across a list of all the judges who had served from 1929 to the present day, names that appear nowhere in public records, yet wield enormous authority in cases that could shake the moral foundation of the Church. Another notable file pertained to suspected money laundering involving the Vatican Bank during the period of 2009 to 2011. Although this was touched upon by the press, the documents I saw contained internal account records and full transcripts from confidential meetings between bishops and their financial advisors. A 2010 report stated plainly There was negligence in the monitoring of transfers from the Opus Dei account to a bank in Liechtenstein. No formal charges were ever filed, but shortly thereafter, the bank's director resigned. There was no press release, no press conference, just a single note in the minutes of his final meeting. We choose to carry the wound rather than expose it to public carving. One of the most haunting cases, and perhaps the most shrouded in mystery, remains that of Emanuela Orlandi, a 15-year-old girl and Vatican citizen who disappeared in 1983. Her case has persisted for decades, spawning countless theories involving the Italian mafia, international political plots, and Vatican cover-ups. Inside the archives, the related file is labeled Reservatissimo, top secret. I was only permitted to see a handful of pages, dated 1985, which included a memo stating that the Vatican had received an anonymous letter claiming that Emanuela was alive and was being held for political negotiation. There was no official response recorded. One cardinal wrote, "If the claim is false, replying invites chaos. If it is true, silence is our last hope." And so, the Vatican chose silence, a silence that has lasted for 40 years. The archive is not a courtroom, but it is where the unspoken judgments are kept, not always to conceal the truth, but because in a place as small and as symbolically immense as the Vatican, every sin becomes systemic. Every failing is not just a personal fall from grace, but a crack in the moral foundation that is shared by millions. And so, the Vatican chooses to handle such matters in the shadows, quietly, with its own law, but without the glare of public light. If the Vatican is a treasury of faith, then its art is the golden key that unlocks the deepest and most profound layers of the human spirit. The breathtaking frescoes on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, the powerful marble sculptures, the stained glass windows that narrate the scriptures through images, all of these have become deeply etched in the memory of humankind. But what very few people realize is this. Some works of art, including sketches, studies, and even fully completed paintings, have never been seen by the public. They remain in a silent, climate-controlled darkness, hidden away within the vaults of the Vatican. One misty morning, I was led down into a quiet basement tucked away behind the Vatican museums, a space that is never included in any guided tour. Beyond 3 heavy iron doors, I found a small vault called the Deposito Pittorico Riservato, the reserved painting repository. Here are housed artworks that have not yet been evaluated, have never been displayed, or have been deliberately withheld for being incompatible with current theological direction. No one says this aloud, of course, but what I saw inside that vault will stay with me forever. The first rack I approached held an unpublished sketch by Michelangelo, a charcoal figure drawn on darkened paper, reaching out in a posture of both pain and longing. It resembled his famous creation of Adam in the Sistine Chapel, but instead of receiving the divine spark of light from God, this figure was surrounded by an encroaching darkness. A small handwritten note beneath the drawing read, * non destinato per la Capella. Troppo umano *, not destined for the chapel. Too human. I wondered what could possibly make a sketch by Michelangelo unworthy of the Vatican's walls. Perhaps it expressed something that theology fears to face, that humanity is not only a creature to be redeemed, but also one that is sometimes abandoned to despair, not always reaching toward the light. On another shelf were 2 oil paintings signed by Raphael Sanzio, although his signature had been faintly painted over in a muted gray ink. An accompanying study noted that the style of these works was too worldly for the rest of his known body of work. One of them depicted a pregnant woman holding a crucifix, a striking and powerful image that was deemed theologically inconsistent, since the Virgin Mary is never portrayed in this way. A small annotation beneath read, * confusio doctrinalis * may cause doctrinal confusion, and so, a masterpiece was veiled not because it lacked beauty, but because it raised uncomfortable questions. I also came across a painting attributed to Caravaggio that had never been put on public display. It showed St. Peter, not yet an apostle, as a humble fisherman. There was dirt on his face, and he was gripping a torn fishing net. There was no divine light, no halo, no sacred symbol, just a tired, weary man at the very beginning of his journey of faith. Was that why it was withheld? Because it lacked the sanctified image of a purified saint? Or because it felt all too real? A different folder, labeled Iconographia Contestata, contested iconography, listed artworks that had been requested to be removed, covered up, or never reproduced. Among them were sculptures of the Virgin Mary portrayed with African and Asian features, created by local artisans during the missionary periods. A 1911 Vatican Cultural Council memo noted, "Diversity is part of divine creation, but uniformity is necessary to preserve sanctity." Under that logic, many of these beautiful and unique statues were never placed upon any altar. There was even a special section dedicated to modern art, which documented the Vatican's decisions to decline exhibitions or collaborations with major artists like Salvador Dali, Francis Bacon, and Ai Weiwei. A 1950 internal document revealed that Dali had proposed creating a series of surrealist revelations of the saints. Vatican officials responded, "We cannot allow sacred imagery to become obscure visual metaphor, but the Vatican does not destroy these works." Quite the opposite. They preserve them with meticulous care, documenting every crack, every brushstroke, and every layer of pigment. And yet, they choose to keep them hidden. Not because the art lacks value, but because in the blinding clarity of theology, that which is too human, too raw, or too unfinished may shake a faith that so often relies on certainty. When I left that vault, I did not carry with me images of angels or crucifixes. I remembered only the eyes covered in dust, the eyes of paintings that had never been seen. And I wonder, perhaps what the Vatican withholds from the world is not withheld out of fear of losing belief, but out of a fear of confronting a version of faith that is still in progress, a faith where saints and sinners, heaven and earth, are still in debate, still unfinished on the canvas. When people think of the Vatican, they think of chapels, prayers, and theology, not of telescopes. And yet, between the concept of faith and the vastness of the cosmos lies a quiet path that is often overlooked. The Vatican is home to one of the oldest astronomical research institutions in the world. And within its archives, what is preserved is not just star charts, but a long and intimate history of the tension and the harmony between heaven and earth, between profound belief and rigorous intellect. My journey began at a small filing cabinet labeled Specola Vaticana, the official name of the Vatican Observatory. Inside were handwritten records from the 17th to the 20th century, detailed notes on comet sightings, solar eclipses, and strange new stars appearing in the night sky. One notebook, dated 1610, which was copied from the original records of Christopher Clavius, the Jesuit astronomer who helped to design the modern Gregorian calendar, contains the line, "The stars are not disorder. They are signs of an order we do not yet understand." In that single line, I saw something deeply revealing. The Vatican never truly turned its back on science. It simply chose its own terms of engagement. Another cabinet held documents, not of condemnation, but of the internal scientific debate that surrounded the Galileo affair. I found a 36-page report from 1616, written by a group of clerics who were trained in mathematics and astronomy. They were seeking to argue that a stationary Earth was natural and in harmony with Scripture. Yet, in a margin note, a young priest had quietly asked, should we not question why Scripture is silent on the matter of centrifugal force? That question was never raised in court, but it was kept, as if the Vatican knew that not all doubts are heresy. Then I found a document that has never been publicly released, a handwritten draft by Pope Benedict XIV, dated 1741, calling for the complete rehabilitation of Galileo's name. It was never officially published, yet the Vatican kept it, perhaps because some acts of redemption do not require loud proclamations, only a quiet reader in the silence. By the 20th century, the Vatican's files grew to include records of international scientific collaboration. A folder from 1935 recorded the Vatican's sponsorship of an expedition to Africa to observe a total solar eclipse. In a letter sent back to Rome, The expedition's leader wrote, "Faith does not prevent us from measuring the darkness. It is because we believe in a divine order that we dare to quantify the vanishing of the light." Another document from 1981 described a private symposium held in the Vatican between theologians and quantum physicists. One Swiss professor presented the multiverse hypothesis. The reaction was not one of rejection. The minutes of the meeting noted, "If God is infinite, the universe need not be singular." It was a rare and remarkable statement. But it was a clear sign that the Vatican had quietly evolved, no longer a rigid guardian of fixed truths, but a house in constant dialogue with the ever-widening edges of human understanding. I even found correspondence between the Vatican and NASA, particularly from around the time that humanity was preparing to set foot on the moon. A handwritten letter from the Holy See to President Kennedy, dated 1962, read, "We pray for those who dare to leave Adam's sky to witness the Creator's work from without." When Apollo 11 succeeded, the Vatican did not hold any public celebrations. But in Pope Paul VI's private journal, one line was recorded, "Today, man does not merely gaze upon the heavens. He has touched them. To my utter astonishment, I also found a copy of a letter from Stephen Hawking to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, dated 1990. In it, he questioned whether God was even necessary in theories of cosmological origins. The Vatican did not offer a rebuttal. A theologian wrote in a confidential note, "If God must hide in the gaps between equations, then he is not truly eternal." That single admission, never made public, said more to me than 1,000 sermons. Faith, when it is genuine, does not fear challenge. Today, the Vatican Observatory still operates quietly from its headquarters at Castel Gandolfo. They make no loud declarations. They do not argue with modern science. But in their archives, I saw something even more profound, a faith that does not seek to extinguish reason, but constantly dares it to reach its furthest boundary, so that when the last starlight finally fades, something immeasurable may still remain. One late afternoon, as the golden sunlight from the dome of St. Peter's Basilica slanted down into the lowest levels of the Vatican archives, I opened a drawer marked Res Diplomaticae ex Orient Tiberia, diplomatic records from the East and the North. Inside were not treaties of the European kind, not pacts signed with Catholic kingdoms, but a series of letters, messages, and transcripts of contact between the Vatican and vast empires that did not share the Christian faith, places where belief did not align, but where power still demanded dialogue. I began with a dossier from the 16th century, detailing the early exchanges between the Vatican and the Ottoman Empire. A letter dated 1584, sent by Sultan Murad III to Pope Gregory XIII, was written in Ottoman Turkish, accompanied by a painstaking Latin translation. In it, the Sultan addressed the Pope as the leader of the believers in the triune God and proposed a commercial pact to ensure mutual respect for their sacred territories. The Vatican's reply did not reject the proposal. It stated, "When peace opens the path to prayer, there is no need for the sword of faith." It was a strange tone, cautious yet yearning for a shared order between two civilizations that had long been portrayed as irreconcilable. In another folder from 1713, I found a transcript of a secret meeting between a Vatican envoy and representatives of the Qing dynasty, which was held in Macau. It recorded the Holy See's deep concern over Emperor Kangshi's decree banning Christianity following the rights controversy. The internal note read, "The court does not reject our faith, but rejects the denial of Chinese rights. We may withdraw the decree. If doing so does not harm sacred doctrine, no agreement was ever reached." But the dialogue itself revealed that the Vatican had come to recognize that bringing faith into another culture required humility, not dogma. What struck me most was a never-declassified file titled Negotiations cum Moscovia. It contained the records of secret efforts from the 17th to the 19th centuries to establish relations between the Vatican and the Russian Tsars. In a memo from 1860, the Vatican noted that the Russian Orthodox Church had become the arm of imperial authority, and that without direct dialogue, any reconciliation between the two churches would remain impossible. A private letter from Pope Pius IX to Tsar Alexander II included the line, "When the throne seeks eternity, it must listen to the voice of the eternal throne." There was no reply, but the Vatican did not stop writing. In a document from 1902, the Vatican recorded a contact with a Japanese scholar who was representing the Meiji court. The two parties discussed theology, culture, and the possibility of a peaceful coexistence between Christian charity and the honor of Shinto. One line in the transcript stood out: "The East does not reject faith. It rejects imposition." It read like a direct reminder to the Church itself. Truth is not a gift that can be forced upon another. I found a 1954 internal memo, written just after the end of the First Indochina War, in which the Vatican proposed sending a secret envoy to North Vietnam to observe the condition of Catholics following the Geneva Accords. There was no official order and no public document. But in the file, the envoy's handwritten note read, "I saw priests celebrating Mass in silence, their vestments hidden under civilian clothes. Faith here makes no noise, but it has never died." The report was never published. One of the most moving files of all was a compilation titled Via Pacis, The Path of Peace, which contained the full correspondence between the Vatican and the United Nations from the end of World War II to the present day. In a 1965 note, written when the Vatican became a permanent observer at the UN, a cardinal wrote, "The Church has no army and no vote, but it may still whisper into the conscience of the world." That line remains true, though today, the world seems to hear those whispers less clearly than it once did. None of these records boast of the Vatican's influence. On the contrary, they show a Vatican that was often in the weaker position, the one initiating contact, the one seeking common ground, the one striving to understand its interlocutor. In the shadows of geopolitical power, the Vatican was never a superpower, but it held another, more patient weapon: time. The Vatican knows how to wait. And when it waits long enough, dynasties collapse, revolutions burn themselves out, and the Holy See continues to write its letters, preserving even the replies that were never sent. When people hear the word miracle, they often picture radiant light, weeping statues, or celestial hymns echoing from the heavens. But when I first stepped into the section labeled Supernaturalist Recencio, Review of Supernatural Phenomena, I saw no light, I smelled no incense, and I heard no sacred sound. What I saw were documents, thousands upon thousands of pages of reports, black and white photographs, audio recordings, medical transcripts, and long columns of clinical analysis, all filed with the meticulous precision of a crime scene investigation. The first file I opened concerned the famous events at Fatima, the apparitions of the Virgin Mary in Portugal in 1917, which are still remembered as a profound miracle. But what the Vatican preserved most carefully was not the content of the visions, but the process of their verification. A memorandum dated October 26, 1930, sent by the Archbishop of Leiria to the Holy See, noted, "We interviewed more than 60 witnesses. We photographed the sun during the foretold times, yet detected no optical distortion in the cameras. However, descriptions by the locals were remarkably consistent regarding the movement of the light. The Vatican did not deny it, but neither did it proclaim it to be a miracle. Instead, it recorded, by theological and pastoral criteria, the event is acceptable for devotion, but it is not binding for belief." That same careful conclusion appears repeatedly across the archive's records of apparitions. Never an outright denial, but always a cautious distance. Another case was that of Lourdes, France, in 1858, where the young Bernadette Soubirous claimed to have seen the Virgin Mary multiple times in a grotto. The Vatican's file on Lourdes preserved detailed transcripts of every single interrogation, from local doctors to senior clergy. One line in the document read, "The girl displays no signs of hallucination." Yet the figure she describes does not match the doctrinal conceptions of the Virgin at the time. Eventually, the Church did not validate the visions directly, but rather the inexplicable recoveries from illness that followed pilgrimages to Lourdes. And the Vatican never rushed to judgment. In another file, I read about the 1973 apparitions in Akita, Japan, which were not officially recognized by the Holy See until over 20 years of investigation had passed. Doctors, psychologists, and theologians were dispatched, and each step of the process was accompanied by detailed internal reports. One particularly telling note read, "The weeping of the statue of the Virgin is chemically verifiable, but scientifically inexplicable. This does not make a miracle. It makes it worthy of monitoring." Then I found a striking registry called Casus Reacti, rejected cases. And it were hundreds of reports that had been deemed fabricated, exaggerated, or lacking any supernatural merit. There were photographs of statues that were weeping due to plumbing leaks, audio recordings that were traced to human manipulation, and witnesses who later retracted their claims. In one Latin American case, the supposed visionary confessed that he had been paid by a local pilgrimage group to feign his visions. The Vatican report simply stated secular motivation. File closed. Another part of the archive held cases of unexplained healings. The Vatican maintains an independent medical panel called the Consulta Medica, which evaluates every supposed miraculous recovery. One file from 2002 described a Parkinson's patient who had fully recovered after praying to the then-blessed John Paul II. The attending physician confirmed the recovery. Still, the Vatican noted, 5 additional years of observation are required to rule out the possibility of natural remission. There was no haste, no sentimentality, just a process as rigorous as any clinical trial. One small file I stumbled upon bore the name Aurora Messina, a 17-year-old girl in Italy who, in 1966, claimed to receive nightly divine prophecies during full moons. Crowds gathered at her home, but internal Vatican notes stated that after 7 months of observation, no objective evidence was found. The divine voice in her room was ultimately traced to a hidden speaker that had been installed under her bed by her brother, who later confessed that he had only wanted to protect the faith of the villagers. The case was sealed with a red stamp. Deceptio pro notorietate. Deception for notoriety. But perhaps the most haunting file of all was one with no date, titled Lux Inter Caecos, Light Among the Blind. It contained the testimony of an elderly priest who was living in a mountain monastery in Switzerland. He claimed to have seen a glowing child in the snow one night, but when he approached, it vanished. He did not ask for recognition. He simply asked the Holy See to record his account, so that if anyone else ever saw it, they would not think themselves mad. The Vatican neither rejected nor affirmed his account. One line from the examiner's note read, "Silence is the only way to preserve the sacred. The Vatican does not chase wonders. It observes. It doubts. It measures every tear from a statue, every unexplained light, every whispered prayer in the fields. And in that silence, it chooses to preserve what it does not yet understand, not to display it, but to remind itself that if God truly reveals himself, he will not need trumpet blasts or newspaper headlines. He will arrive in moments no one expects and no one hears, except for those who are patient enough to wait, as the Vatican has done for centuries." I never meant to seek out the prophecy of St. Malachy. For many within the Vatican, that name evokes more discomfort than reverence. Yet one day, while I was researching documents related to early 17th century councils, I stumbled upon a thin file that had been tucked inside an unrelated dossier. Its cover was marked simply De Prophetia Malachii, Versio Inedita, on the prophecy of Malachy, unpublished version. Inside was a handwritten copy dated 1595, the same year the prophecy was first printed in Rome by a Benedictine monk named Arnold de Wyan in his work Lignum Vitae. The reason the Vatican preserved this manuscript was not out of any belief in its authenticity, but rather to monitor how it spread. A margin note by the famous Cardinal Baronius read, "The people are enamored with this prophecy as if it were a fifth gospel. But faith built upon fear is not faith." The prophecy of St. Malachy is said to have been written by the Irish Archbishop Malachy O'Morgair during a pilgrimage to Rome in 1139. In it, he supposedly listed 112 short, cryptic Latin mottos, each one meant to correspond to a future pope, from Celestine II up to the very last, who, it is said, would witness the fall of the Holy City and the Day of Judgment. In the Vatican archives, I found an internal table, one never made public, that mapped each prophetic phrase to an actual pontiff. Some of the connections were eerily accurate. Lumen in Calo, light in the sky, was linked to Pope Leo XIII, whose coat of arms bore a radiant star. Pastor Angelicus, the angelic shepherd, seemed to fit Pius XII, who was revered for his deep spiritual life. But the further down the list I went, the weaker the connections became. Ultimately, a Vatican memo from 1978 concluded, "This is the effect of reading backward. People assign meaning to what is already past, not to what is to come." Still, what prevented the Vatican from outright denouncing the prophecy was its final, chilling line. In Persecution Extrema S. R. E sedebit Petrus Romanus, in the final persecution of the Holy Roman Church, Peter the Roman shall sit upon the throne. And then the city of 7 hills shall be destroyed, and the dreadful judge will judge his people. Then came 2013. Pope Benedict XVI resigned, the first papal abdication in 6 centuries. His successor was Jorge Mario Bergoglio, who took the name Francis. He was born in Buenos Aires, but he was of Italian descent, Roman blood. Although no pope has ever taken the name Peter II, the Vatican suddenly received hundreds of letters from the faithful around the world, all asking the same thing. Is this the final pope? One internal document I found recorded a meeting of several cardinals in 2014, just a few months after Francis's election. During the meeting, a young bishop expressed his concern that this prophecy is being weaponized to fuel apocalyptic anxiety and to undermine reform. The dean of the College of Cardinals replied simply, "The Church does not fear the end. We only fear that people will stop living for tomorrow." Another file, titled Legendum, non-publicandum, to be read, not published, documented a Vatican commission that had once investigated the true origins of the prophecy. Several scholars argued that the entire text was actually a forgery, written in the late 16th century to support specific candidates in a papal conclave. One historian asked bluntly, if Malachi truly wrote this, why is it never once mentioned for 400 years? But in the end, the Vatican reached no official conclusion. The file ends with a single line. "We do not publish what may cause confusion, even in order to deny it." And so, the prophecy remains a ghost, neither authenticated nor erased, neither confirmed nor condemned. It has become part of the mythos that surrounds the Vatican, like tales of hidden staircases, secret chapels beneath the basilica, or whispers of angels heard during papal elections. Is it real? Does it matter? Perhaps those questions no longer require answers. As one elderly bishop once whispered to me while turning the final page of that prophecy, there are words God never spoke, but which he left behind for men to decide whether to believe in or not. The archive labeled Archivio Pio 12 remained sealed for more than 70 years. It was not until 2020 that parts of it were finally declassified, but even those that were disclosed were only the surface. When I first stepped into that room, the fresh air of the Vatican hallways seemed to vanish, replaced by an invisible weight, the weight of pages unstained by blood, yet heavy with the silent deaths of millions. I opened a folder titled Latir non rispost, 1942, Unanswered Letters, 1942. Inside were dozens of desperate pleas from Jewish communities all across Europe, written during the most brutal years of the Holocaust. One letter, dated August 1942, came from a rabbi in Slovakia. It read, "We do not ask for a public intervention. We only ask that you affirm that God is not silent." There was no reply in the file, only a faint pencil mark in the margin. Forwarded to the Secretariat of State. Response pending. Another folder recorded the Vatican's contacts with Nazi officials. In a memorandum dated November 1939, the German ambassador to the Vatican, Diego von Bergen, pledged, "The Reich will respect religious freedom if the Holy See maintains its neutrality on internal matters." Cardinal Maglione, who was then the Secretary of State, replied, "We do not intervene in politics, but we will speak if innocent life is threatened." And yet, if that voice ever spoke, It never reached the public. One internal report shook me to my very core. It was a document addressed directly to Pope Pius XII, dated October 1943, just weeks after the Jews of Rome had been deported by fascist authorities. It stated, nearly 1,000 Jews were taken from the city on October 16th. The train departed from Tiburtina station. The destination is unknown. The report was signed by a Jesuit priest from a local parish. There was no directive attached to it. But on the following page, in faint, trembling handwriting, someone had written, "Could not prevent. Prayer is the last recourse." I found no handwritten orders from Pius XII commanding silence. But what I did find was a profound absence. An absence in the speeches, the messages, and the public declarations throughout the period when Jewish people were being slaughtered en masse. A folder titled Discorsi Mancani, Missing Speeches, contained the drafts of 3 separate addresses that were never delivered. One of them, dated December 24th, 1942, bore the title Sic et Stelle in Nacht, like stars in the night. And it was the line, "We grieve for the millions of innocents who have been destroyed, whether for their race, their faith, or their language." But that powerful message was never read aloud. A note scribbled beside it read, "Would endanger German parishes. We must wait," but the waiting never ended. Still, the Vatican did not remain entirely silent behind its closed doors. I read hundreds of records documenting secret efforts to save Jewish people, especially through the use of monasteries, churches, and other religious institutions across Italy, France, and Poland. A 1944 file noted, the Santa Brigida convent has hidden over 200 Jews, disguised as pilgrims. The abbot accepts personal responsibility if they are discovered. There were dozens more such cases. Yet no public statement from the Holy See ever confirmed or protected these heroic actions, because a single word could have dragged hundreds of people out into the light and to their deaths. A letter from Bishop Angelo Rada in Budapest, dated 1944, read, "If we speak, they will kill more. If we remain silent, our conscience will die." There was no recorded reply. But in a private memo, I found a single handwritten line, and signed, "To choose between a voice and a life, no one is holy enough to choose rightly." After the war, a file labeled Die Fees e Silenzi, Defenses and Silences, contained the transcripts of internal meetings that were preparing for the coming wave of criticism. One cardinal suggested a public statement, declaring that the Holy See had quietly saved many lives during the Nazi reign. The proposal was rejected. Instead, the Vatican chose to continue its silence and to let the world debate. One final note read, "We do not speak. History will find the words, and history has never stopped searching for them." Some say that Pope Pius XII lacked courage. Others say that he did all that he could within the immense limits of his office and his time. But what I saw in the archives was not a final judgment. It was the fractured and painful record of a moment when moral clarity was pushed to its absolute limits. There were no heroic proclamations, no easy apologies, only the lingering and undeniable truth of a cold reality. Silence, whether it is born of fear or of strategy, leaves an echo that can never be erased. After hundreds upon hundreds of hours of reading, turning page after worn and fragile page, deep beneath the earth where no church bells ring and no candles flicker, I began to ask myself, why does the Vatican keep all of this? Skeptics might say it is to control, to conceal, or to avoid facing the truth. But if that were all, why not simply destroy it all long ago? Why preserve, with such meticulous care and precision, every internal memo, every unanswered plea for help, every draft of a speech that was never spoken? I gradually came to understand that the Vatican does not merely preserve the truth, it preserves the complexity of the truth. In those archives, there are no easy justifications, no blatant lies. There are gaps, silences, and half-told stories. But there are also the voices of those who were once buried at the bottom of history, the questions that were never allowed to echo, and the small, quiet acts that save hundreds of lives without ever asking to be credited. The Vatican knows better than anyone that a truth spoken at the wrong time can become a weapon. And so they choose to hold it, not to manipulate, but to wait. They do not rush to open every door at once. They seem to believe that each generation should only know what it is ready to understand, and that, as difficult as it may be to accept, is also a form of responsibility. I still remember the room at the far end of the Western Hall, a small, simple chamber behind an old wooden door inscribed with the Latin words Veritas Tempus Filia Est. Truth is the daughter of time. Inside, there were no files, only a single wooden desk and a blank book. The elderly archivist whispered to me, "This is where no more questions are asked. This is where only listening remains." I sat there, not to write, but to reread in the silence every chapter of history I had encountered. From secret meetings with emperors to hidden works of art, from miracle investigations to the Vatican silence during World War II, the role of women, of science, of rituals never performed, all of it flowing like an invisible current through millennia. I did not leave with easy answers, but I did leave with a profound certainty. The Vatican archives is not a place where the truth is buried, but where the truth is protected from oversimplification. Truth does not always comfort. Sometimes it reveals popes who doubted, saints who faltered, and angels in paintings that were the face of fear. But it is that kind of truth that makes faith, if it survives, truly mature. And perhaps that is why the archive continues to open, bit by bit, not in line with the demands of history, but with the evolving conscience of humankind. When we are brave enough to look at the unvarnished face of our own faith, then the doors of the Vatican will open, not with a key, but with the quiet readiness to understand and to forgive. I did not leave the Vatican feeling as though I had exited a fortress of secrets, but rather a chapel that was waiting for someone to return, not to worship, but to listen to history, to memory, and to oneself. If what you have just heard feels like more than a story, if it feels like a door quietly opening to something deeper, if you believe that the truth does not always lie on the surface, and that sometimes silence is its own form of storytelling, please consider supporting this channel by clicking subscribe, not just to walk with us through the journeys that lie ahead, but to help keep this kind of deep, patient storytelling alive in a world that is so often crowded with noise. Your single subscription is like a single candle, lit among the shadows of an archive that is filled with memory and with silence. Thank you for listening with patience and with heart. I will see you in the next story.